Hello, BookTube. I have Bell Redemptions. This is Weekly Reads. This reading week goes from last Friday, December 12th, to yesterday, December 18th. I have 5 Bell Redemptions and Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer, which I will get to at the end because the 5 Bell Redemptions are currently on top of Inventing the Renaissance. For those of you who don't know, bailing is my term for not finishing a book or putting it aside, and a Bell Redemption is giving another look to that book, however many times that actually turns out to be. So my personal project for December has been to try to Bell redeem as many of my bells from 2025 as I can before the end of the year, and I'm quite pleased with my progress. So far, including these 5 bells, I have 8 bell redemptions so far. So I'm making good progress, although I don't think I'm going to get to as many of the bells that I would have liked to. But anyway, let's get started because there are quite a lot of books and plays to talk about. So I'm going to start with the drama. So on Friday and Saturday, I read some of the drama that I have belled on this past year. So I'm going to start with The Skin of Our Teeth by Thornton Wilder, which I read and bell redeemed on Friday. The Skin of Our Teeth is a strange play. Very strange play. It is in part about your typical early mid-century American family living in New Jersey. But this family also represents the first family and every family and the family as nation. The first act is both set at an early suburban city in the 1940s, but it is also set in prehistory as an ice age is approaching. The second act takes place in Atlantic City during a convention of humans as an apocalyptic hurricane is approaching. The third and final act takes place in the aftermath of a civil war in which the father of the family and the son of the family were on opposite sides. There are also instances where the play seemingly breaks down as one of the characters breaks character and addresses the audience. There are some other disruptions throughout the play. It's incredibly weird and strange, and I don't quite know what to make of it. I'm happy that I read it, although I don't think The Skin of Our Teeth is one of Thornton Wilder's best. I think he's still, Our Town is still, as far as I know of, probably the best thing he ever wrote. Although I've only read 2 things by Thornton Wilder. Moving on to Saturday, I bell redeemed and reread A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry and bell redeemed Ma Rainey's Black Bottom by August Wilson. So, A Raisin in the Sun is a classic of American drama. It's about a family of African Americans living in Chicago. The younger family are working class. The family is composed of the matriarch, Mama, her adult children, Walter Lee, who is in his mid-30s, Beneatha, who has just turned 20, Walter Lee's wife Ruth, and their 10-year-old son Travis. Big Walter, the patriarch of the family, died some months before the play begins, and the family is expecting a life insurance payout. And what to do with this money has become a bone of contention for the adult members of the family. Walter Lee believes that as the male of the family, he deserves the money. And he wants to use that money to invest in a liquor store, which Mama, who is the beneficiary of the policy, is opposed to. And so there's a lot of conflict over what to do with the money and consequences from what ultimately is done with the money. So Mama goes and puts down a down payment on a house in a white neighborhood, which gives the idea of which is to give the family a fresh start. They're fraying at the seams where they're currently living. And Walter Lee continues his weeks-long temper tantrum about not getting the money. So Mama gives him the rest of the money, part of which was supposed to go to Beneatha's tuition, and Walter Lee just gives all of it to one of his cronies, who then runs off with it, which leaves them with nothing. And once the neighborhood knows that the family who's moving in is African American, they try to dissuade them, both by trying to buy them out as well as subtly threatening them, because there are reports throughout the play that other families, African American families who have moved into white neighborhoods, have been bombed out of their homes. And once the money's gone, Walter Lee, at least initially, seems to give in before he rallies and just says, "We'll try to be good neighbors, and we don't want your money." Another subplot of the play is Beneatha and her two suitors, the wealthy assimilated George and the Nigerian student Asagai, and Beneatha's political awakening as she aspires to become a doctor. So I have read this play at least once before, probably twice before. Once in high school and then once in college. I don't know if I read it for pleasure in that time period as well. But this is my first reread attempt, ignoring the fact that I had to go at it earlier this year in quite some time. And I found myself not really getting on with it as much as I would have liked. I found myself really losing patience with Walter Lee. He basically is spending most of the play throwing a temper tantrum, either because he's not getting what he wants or because he screwed up. And it really bugged me. But one thing that I did notice about this play is how prescient it is, both in race relations as well as gender relations, but also ultimately in the crisis in masculinity, which Walter Lee has in spades, as well as Beneatha's aspirations to become a doctor, to improve herself, and her political awakening, which is really what I gravitated towards. I really enjoyed Beneatha's plot. So I'm not entirely sure if I necessarily enjoyed my reread of a Raisin in the Sun, but I am glad that I did manage to reread it. Because it is quite powerful, even if maybe not necessarily, at least at this reading, something that I completely enjoyed. So moving on to Ma Rainey's Black Bottom by August Wilson. This is set in 1920s Chicago, where a famous African-American performer, Ma Rainey, is going to record some songs for an album alongside her band. And her band is really the focus of the play. They're a fractious lot, particularly the main character, Levy, who is the trombone player. He has aspirations to become a famous musician on his own, leading a band, and he has promises from the studio boss that he's going to get a chance. And throughout the play, things begin to fall apart for Levy. This Ma Rainey's Black Bottom is very much a tragedy, as both the producer screws him over and Levy self-destructs throughout the course of the play, which I thought was incredibly powerful. Although, again, I didn't necessarily enjoy Levy's character. I really found him quite detestable. And it wasn't in the sense, so in part I did enjoy reading Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, but I also really found Levy quite detestable. So that was my Friday and Saturday reads. I'm going to skip Sunday because that's what when I read another chunk of Inventing the Renaissance. So moving on to Monday, I Belle Redeemed Open Heaven by Sean Hewitt. This is a novel about a young gay man named James who falls in love with a slightly older young man who has come, named Luke, who has come to his village for a year because his family is having issues, so he is temporarily moved in with his uncle and aunt. And over the course of that year, James's life has become subsumed with his friendship obsession with Luke that has become all-consuming and ultimately all-obliterating, as even 20 years later, this relationship colors, influences, poisons James's other relationships. Because the novel opens with James, his marriage ending, and his husband leaving him. And James contemplating buying the farm of where Luke lived during that year. And so the book opens with James returning to his home village, where apparently his family no longer lives. And we'll get to that issue. And then, so there's kind of a bookend for that, although not quite. So the book is broken into autumn, winter, spring, and finally summer. And I have decidedly mixed opinions about this book. There are some brilliant bits. I think Sean Hewitt is really good at descriptions, at setting the natural scene, of setting the scene of Thornmere. There are also some incredibly impactful scenes between James and Luke. Namely, at the end of the spring section, there was a really heartbreaking moment and scene that is brilliant. But there's ultimately Open Heaven is a rather disappointing first novel. Maybe more than rather. It is disappointing because the relationship between James and Luke is everything in this novel. All other relationships are barely sketched in. In fact, I would say most of the characters, James included, is barely sketched in. He's solely defined by this obsession with Luke. That there's really, what else is he interested in? What else is he doing with his life? It's all Luke all the time. His relationship with his parents are combative, but it's not really delved into. His relationship with his younger brother, which would be really interesting because Eddie has developmental issues. His classmates. We're told that there is a distance between James, who has recently, or a year prior or so, come out, or that his sexuality was revealed and that he acknowledged it publicly. But that there's a distance between him and his classmates, but is there really? Because it doesn't seem that his classmates are that ostracizing towards him, or that they're not really ostracizing him. That he could. It's just like all Luke all the time, and it just. And I think where one thing that I kind of would say is that ultimately this relationship is quite toxic, but that's not really delved into. I think Hewitt wants the reader to appreciate the beauty of this love, however one-sided it may be, because what Luke's getting out of this, how he's viewing this relationship, is never touched on. Everything is from James's perspective. He is the narrator. But ultimately, this relationship, it's so all-consuming that it obliterates, it poisons everything else. So, it is by nature rather toxic. Also, I think it has to be noted that, this story has been told how many times before? And it's, isn't gay literature ready for new narratives, or at least the attempt to find and create new narratives? So I'm happy that I did Bill redeem it, but hopefully if Sean Hewitt decides that he wants to write another novel, he gets better, because this novel, I think, really needed a lot more work, particularly where there's this climax at the end of the spring section that is just completely undercut in the summer section. And it's like, really? Anyway. So enough of Open Heaven. And I think I might reread Sean Hewitt's, the poetry that I have of his, to see something. Because I kind of have an idea. Maybe he's, I don't know. Maybe or maybe not. Anyway, let's move on to Homeland of My Body, New and Selected Poems by Richard Blanco, which I'm quite happy to say I have finally bell redeemed after 3 attempts this year. So, Homeland of My Body is a collection of poetry by Richard Blanco. The new poems form bookends for the selected section, which is then in chronological order. And on this Bell Redemption, which I started last week, I read the first batch of new poems and the first 2 collections. Because there's the new poems and then 4 poetry collections that have been selected. So I read the first half last week and then the second half yesterday, and I really enjoyed it. I finally got Richard Blanco's poetry and quite enjoyed it. So I'm very happy that I did manage this Bell Redemption. And so I might be looking for more of Richard Blanco's work, particularly his collections. I'm going to actually try to go for all of them. But for sure, from looking for the Gulf Motel, I really, really enjoyed that one. But also, probably How to Love a Country would be the first 2 that I would go for. But really enjoyed this Bell Redemption. So now it's on to Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer. So this is a new history of the Renaissance, which is a period of history that is roughly from sometime in the 13th or 14th century, depending who you talk to the end of the sometime in the 16th century, but certainly probably does not go into the 17th century. Again, it depends who you talk to. So, Inventing the Renaissance is both a history of this period, mostly centered on Venice, as well as a look at how the Renaissance was created by later generations of scholars, what the factors that made this period sexy to them, also to not necessarily trust, to be skeptical of this formulation, as well as Ada Palmer's own version of this history. So the book is divided into discrete parts. So once again, the first part, why you shouldn't believe anyone, including me, about the Renaissance, is largely about how the Renaissance was created by later generations of scholars, as well as what the various factors that they saw that made this time period sexy. The second part, Desperate Times and Desperate Measures, is largely Ada Palmer's Renaissance Part 1. And then Part 3 is Let's Meet Some People from This Golden Age, which is biographical sketches of various people that Ada Palmer finds interesting. And that is actually where I spend my Sunday. So last time I talked about this story, I ended at chapter 13:9, which is a biography of Raffaello Maffei il Volterrano. So that's where I started this time. And then I got through Lucrezia Borgia, Camilla Bottolini Uccelli, and Michelangelo. And that was it. I barely got 100 pages in this time around, and that was disappointing. I find myself not really enjoying this book. And in fact, I am rather dreading the next part of the third part, which is a long biographical sketch of Machiavelli, who is very prominent in this book. So I'm not entirely sure if I want to continue, if I am okay with inventing the Renaissance being a complete fail. I've given it enough looks. I've gotten far enough in to know that this is just not for me. Ada Palmer is a specialist in the history of ideas, and so her focus in much of this book is on that, is the intellectual history of this period, which is not something that I'm particularly interested in. I'm more interested in the politics and the art and how that interplays with the politics. So I did enjoy the Lucrezia Borgia chapter, but the rest of it, not so much. And while Palmer's approach using humor and these quippy asides can be at times fun, and I guess maybe refreshing if you've read a ton of really dry or academic works on the Renaissance, then it's kind of a breath of fresh air. But it's just, I'm like, it just, to me, it just comes off as a gimmick. So I'm not entirely sure what I want to do. I will think about it the next day or two and decide. And if I do decide to go ahead and let it go and just say, okay, I'm done with it, then I will report back next weekly reads first thing. So my reading plan for this coming reading week is, I think today I'm going to try to get at least one or two short stories from Paris Stories by Mavis Gallant, Bell Redeemed. And then I think I'm going to try My Name is Read by Orhan Pamuk. And see if I can finally get that novel, Bell Redeemed. And maybe The Natural by Bernard Malamud, depending on how things work out. I will, of course, report back next week on how things actually do turn out. So, looking at how much time there's left in 2025 and what I have left outside of my plans for this coming week, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave Etudes by Friederike Mayrocker on the pile. I will probably go ahead and move The Golden Road and Weaver Scraps and Kings back to where they belong on my history shelves. And I will probably do the same for The Way We Live Now and Bleak House, because I will not have the time to get to either of them. So maybe next March of the Mammoths might be Dickens versus Trollope, or maybe I could try it again with next October, depending on how things shape up. So anyway, so I think probably The Recent East and A Brief History of Seven Killings I will keep out, so that these three will also be on the docket. And I will report back on how things turn out. So, as far as BookTube plans for next week, I still would like to do some sketches for my 2026 reading plans, but it's not quite working out how I would like it to. I tried to do a sketch for my manga plans next year a few times this week, and it didn't really pan out. So, yeah, so I don't know exactly how I'm going to do that. I will try again, and if there are any missed videos next week, that's probably why. I might also try to do a tag video if there are any still ongoing, and maybe try some discussion videos, although sometimes those don't quite work out for me. Anyway, this weekly reads is going a little too long, so I'm going to go ahead and sign off for now. So thank you, BookTube. Have a great rest of your afternoon and Friday, and have a great weekend, and I will certainly see you next week. So until then, thank you, BookTube, and stay safe.